Welcome everybody to the Centro Sefarat Israel YouTube channel, and also welcome to this talk with Mr. Jonathan Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman, thank you very much for attending to us today.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Jonathan Kaufman is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter who has written and reported on China for 30 years for the Boston Globe, where he covered the 1989 massacre in Tiananmen Square, the Wall Street Journal, where he served as China bureau chief from 2002 to 2005, and Bloomberg News. He is the author of A Hole in the Heart of the World, Being Jewish in the Eastern Europe, and Broken Alliance, The Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews in America, winner, by the way, of the National Jewish Book Award. He's the director of the School of Journalism at Northeastern University in Boston, and his new book is The Last Kings of Shanghai, a story of two Jewish families, the Kadoories and the Sassoons, two dynasties who flourished in Shanghai and Hong Kong during the 20th century. And precisely, we are going to talk with him about this book. Mr. Kaufman, first of all, I would like to ask you for introducing this book. What will find the readers who decide to open it?
Well, I think they're going to find a saga, really, that spans 175 years. It starts in Baghdad in the 1800s, in the early 19th century, where the Sassoons are one of the most prominent families in Baghdad. They're very wealthy. They're advisors to the rulers of Baghdad. And then the politics turn against them, and they're forced to flee Baghdad. And in fact, David Sassoon, the patriarch of the family, is imprisoned. He's probably going to be executed. His father smuggles him out of prison, hustles him down to the port, wraps him in a cloak, sews pearls inside the cloak, puts him on a boat, and sends him off to escape. And David Sassoon ends up in India just when the British Empire is expanding. And at that point, he decides to try to reclaim his birthright, trying to build his trading networks. And then China is opening up in the 1840s with the opium trade. He gets involved in the opium trade and then uses his sort of business savvy and his new technologies to sort of create a fortune. And then for the next 175 years, the Sassoons and this other family, the Kadoories, stand astride Chinese business and politics. They become billionaires. They're involved in the rise of the nationalist government in China. They're involved in imperialism and colonialism. They're in Shanghai during World War II when the Japanese invade. The Kadoories are imprisoned. They help save 18,000 Jewish refugees. And then, of course, the communists come and they lose everything. The Sassoons leave and never come back to China, but the Kadoories go to Hong Kong, rebuild their fortune, and then return to China in the 19th. And even today are the richest Western family still in China, based in Hong Kong. So it's really a story about families, about opium smuggling, about the rise of China. And it reads like a novel, but it's all true.
And how did the story, this novel, the story of these two families get to you? When was the first time you heard about them?
Well, I first visited China back in the late 1970s when China was just opening up to Americans. Mao had just died a few years before, and going to China was like going into a black and white movie. Everybody was dressed the same, everybody was riding bicycles everywhere. It really was as if time had stopped in the 1940s. And I was walking along the Bund, that famous waterfront in Shanghai with the Art Deco buildings. And frankly, I was looking for a place to go to the bathroom. And so I stepped into this hotel, the Peace Hotel, and that there was marble hallways, crystal windows and chandeliers, and a bellhop came up to me in a white uniform with a little white cap. And when I asked him in English where the bathroom was, he responded to me in French. And I thought to myself, what is this place? Where did it come from? And someone told me it was built actually by a very wealthy Jewish playboy billionaire. Victor Sassoon had built this hotel back in the 1930s. And at the time, it was the center not only of social life in Shanghai, but from all around the world. Charlie Chaplin would go there, Noel Coward. People would come from all over the world to visit Shanghai. I also went to visit a it was called the Children's Palace. It was sort of a big mansion where the Chinese kids were practicing piano and doing recitals and concerts, the kind of very controlled environment the Chinese like to take reporters to show them everything is just fine in China. And as I left there, and it was just beautiful, huge ballrooms, beautiful grounds. And as I left there was a little plaque on the door that said this had once been the home for a single family, 3 people and 43 rooms, called the Kadoories. Now, I knew the Kadoori family because they're very prominent in Hong Kong, where I was based. They immensely wealthy, own the Peninsula Hotel chain, own the power company in Hong Kong. And so I kept on seeing kind of Jews popping up everywhere in Shanghai. And then I was one day in a neighborhood in a part of Shanghai, just to the north of the Bund, and I was walking along, and I saw signs there was like a synagogue nearby, and there were shades of like mezuzahs, that Jews put on the doorposts of their houses, on some of the door frames. And I thought, when were there Jews living in this neighborhood? So there was a little old Chinese woman doing her marketing on the corner. And so I went up to her with my Chinese translator, and in my broken Chinese, I said, she seemed like she would have been alive back in the 40s. And I said, do you remember that Jewish people might have lived here in this neighborhood? And she immediately dropped her package and said, come with me, come with me. And we skittered across the alley and went up the stairs into what clearly had once been a grand apartment. But it was now chopped up into individual rooms with lots of, Chinese families living there. And she took us to her room. And in the middle of her room was this beautiful Biedermeier bed and chest of drawers, clearly built in Berlin or Vienna in the 1930s. And she said, the Jewish people you asked about, they lived here. They lived here back then. And I said, oh, really? And she said to me, have you come back for the furniture? So there's a way in which, that Jews were popping up in these unusual places. So that's what sort of set me to try to find out who these families were, what their influence was, and how they got there and what they did.
It's an amazing story. How did these 2 families participate in the economic boom to open China to the world during the 20th century? Because it's not only the hotel, they have also different companies.
Right. Well, the Sassoons, which were the wealthiest family, they were probably one of the wealthiest families in the world in the 1920s and 1930s. They made their money in opium. There's a famous saying that all great fortunes are based on a great crime. And in this case, the crime was opium. Now, opium was actually legal after 1840. The Chinese had tried to keep it out. The British basically invaded China to open up the Chinese market and open it to opium, which was very profitable for the British in India. It was used somewhat in Europe. So the Sassoons basically saw a business opportunity with opium. And one of the things they did, which was kind of interesting, they were for their time very technologically innovative. So they decided to buy steamships because that was a faster way to get opium from India, where it was grown, to China, where the market was, faster than using sailing ships that other companies used. They were among the first people to use the telegraph, which let them find out what the prices were in Shanghai for opium before they left to sell it. Now, the Sassoons will tell you today, well, opium was legal. It was like cigarettes. It was like alcohol. It was a vice. But they knew how bad opium was. It was a terrible problem for the Chinese. Probably 10 or 15% of Chinese were addicted to opium. The Sassoons themselves had to fire Chinese employees who couldn't function because they were using opium. But, it was profitable, and the Sassoons used all their influence. They became very influential in England to make sure it stayed legal for as long as possible. When opium was finally made illegal around 1911, they moved all their money into real estate. They bought factories. They built the tram line in Shanghai. And they then, became very successful that way. When the communists took over, they seized the business records of the Sassoons. And I had a chance to look at them, and the Chinese calculated that the Sassoons probably made $2.3 billion $2.3 billion from their opium business. And that really was the foundation of their fortune. And I think it's something that the Chinese still remember today. There's still a sense that when the Chinese talk about dealing with the West and a lot of the tensions between the US and China and Europe and China, there's always in the back of the Chinese minds, you were once imperialists, you were colonialists, you came here and sold these drugs to us. And that's something that many Chinese still remember. And it's something that, you know, the West has to remember as well.
That's it. What happened with these two families when the communists swept into the power?
Well, you know, the Sassoons and the Kadoories were very shrewd business people. They were very good at business. They became immensely wealthy. They weren't very good politicians in the end. You know, when I've talked to the Kadoorie family, they say that the patriarch, their grandfather, he lived in a bubble. He was living in a mansion with 43 rooms, just he and two of his sons, just 3 people with 43 rooms, 40 servants. And they never saw the kind of revolution that was bubbling up beneath them. Victor Sassoon, who was the Playboy billionaire who built the hotel that I talk about, he used to say he built a beautiful suite for himself. And in it, he built 2 bathtubs. And when people said, why do you have 2 bathtubs? He said, well, I don't mind sharing my bed with someone, but I don't want to share my bath. So one of his lovers, in fact, was a woman named Emily Hahn, an American journalist. And at the same time, she was having an affair with Victor Sassoon. She was also having an affair with a Chinese leftist poet and going to parties in Shanghai where she met Zhou Enlai. This was sort of the amazing thing about Shanghai. You could have these immensely wealthy families, and then a mile away, the communists were plotting revolution. So she would go to these parties with Zhou Enlai and other communists and come back to Victor Sassoon and say, you know, this is serious. The communists are planning a revolution. And Victor Sassoon dismissed it because he was wining and dining the nationalists and dealing with the Americans and the British. So when the communists came in, both families were surprised by it. Both had to flee. I mean, the book is filled with stories of them scrambling to try to smuggle out their artwork and bribing ship captains to sort of take their antiques out of Shanghai. But in the end, you know, they had to leave. Victor Sassoon left and never returned. He lost almost everything in Shanghai. The Kadoories were different. They left for Hong Kong. And their father had died under Japanese captivity during World War II in Shanghai. And when the 2 men, his 2 sons, took over the business, they concluded their father had made a big mistake, that he had been so isolated in his mansion that he didn't see that their whole fortune would be at risk. And so the Kadoories in Hong Kong, while they made an immense amount of money, also devoted a tremendous amount of money to charity. They started supporting Chinese refugees who were coming to Hong Kong. They worked very hard to do research into improving the food supply of Hong Kong, including developing new strains of pork and pig. The Chinese used to joke the fact that the Kadoories know everything about pigs except how they taste, because they wouldn't eat it because they were keeping kosher. And politically, they made sure to keep contacts open to the communists. And so when Hong Kong reverted to China, the Kadoories were invited back in by the Chinese to invest and to build things. So, you know, it's really a story of how business often has to accommodate politics, that you can't separate the two. And today, of course, in Hong Kong, we see how, once again, as in Shanghai, the communists are regaining control, tightening the screws, and the Kadoories, who are, as I say, the wealthiest Western family in Hong Kong right now, are once again having to navigate kind of their business success with this new political reality. And I think that's something companies all over the world, in Europe and the US, are dealing with. If you're a Western company, a Western businessman who wants to deal with China, how do you deal with the fact that you may not be in full control of the situation?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Kaufman, to end this interview, I would like to ask you about the process of documentation for this book, because it should have been very, very exhaustive for you. How was this process for the book?
Well, it was, it was exhausting, but it was also fun. I mean, I think that I'm a journalist by training, and I think all journalism begins with questions. And I think part of what drew me to this book was not just the history and the sweep of it and understanding what China was like, but also understanding there was a different history of China. We tend to think of China as being, this poor country with a rich culture. The communists took it over. But there was this period in the 20s and 30s when Shanghai was one of the most exciting cities in the world. It was like New York and London, and learning about that was very exciting. But it was also exciting for me to see the families. In the end, this is a story about fathers and sons, and fathers trying to control their sons. It's about women in these families who kept on trying to move up and were sort of slapped down and literally declared insane or dying in house fires because they were in China. There's a lot of family tragedy in this book. And then there's also great heroic moments. So for example, when 18,000 Jewish refugees show up in Shanghai fleeing the Nazis, Victor Sassoon and the Kadoories kind of step up, and they save these families, they protect them, they feed them. And it's one of the great stories that come out of the Holocaust, which is enabling 18,000 families to survive who would have died otherwise. So I think seeing the way people respond in moments of crisis is something that I found very compelling. And that's what kind of made the research, while it took me all around the world in many languages, in the end, I just kept on returning to the drama of these people trying to live through history and shaping it. And that always makes for kind of a fun way to get up in the morning and dive into it.
So, Mr. Kaufman, thank you very much for your time today. And thanks also for all of you who are following us. We remind you that you can share this video on your social networks. So thank you very much to all.
Thank you again. I enjoyed doing it.